What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Draft Rankings podcast. Today, Monday, May 6th, it's going to be a solo pod. Going forward, things are going to change a little bit as far as how the shows are laid out. We're still going to be doing 3 shows per week here on YouTube as well as on podcast, The Draft Rankings on podcast, The Draft Rankings podcast on YouTube. You can find them at both places. Please click that like button. Please click subscribe if you're here on YouTube. If you're listening on podcast, again, drop 5 stars. Leave a review if you can. We'd appreciate it, and it helps a lot with the growth of the show. Today is going to be a short, terse show. It's not going to be 40 minutes, probably about 15 to 20. I'm going to talk about the class of 2025 and the wide receivers to be looking at in that class and things that we're going to be looking for in the 2024 season, because we had a ton, and I mean a metric ton, of transfers this past spring, and we've seen them now play through the spring ball, and we have a big grouping of guys that are, I should say, aged, but also guys ready to take over and become the top guy in the class. Right now, if we just start from the top down, it's Luther Burden. Luther Burden from Missouri, who was the runner-up list last year for the butchered it already from the jump. Sorry, Luther Burden was the runner-up last year for the Biletnikoff Award behind Marvin Harrison Jr. Some thought Luther would be the Biletnikoff winner, but Marv did not have one, so Marvin Harrison Jr. and indeed won that from Ohio State. But Luther Burden finished last year with 1,200 yards, 9 touchdowns in his sophomore season. He led Missouri to an 11-2 record this last year with Brady Cook, with Cody Schrader at the helm in Missouri. I was just doing a write-up over at orangebloods.com going through groupings in the 2025 class, 2026, whatever it is, but the 2024 season. Missouri came in with the 6th best receiving core, according to me, when you utilize PFF receiving grades, when you utilize what they've acquired, what they've lost. They have Theo Wees that came over from Oklahoma, and Mookie Cooper. Marquise Johnson's another receiver that averaged nearly 30 yards per reception last year for Missouri. Again, only had 13 receptions, but a group that is very strong. But Luther Burden is the first name that comes to mind in the 2025 class, a wide receiver that his stature is not that large, but Luther Burden is a reminds me of Jordan Addison to a T. And I think that's kind of the expectation you can have. The guy's about 5'11". He's about 205, 200 pounds at Missouri right now. And he fits the archetype, I should say, but I'm hesitant to roll with it because he doesn't play like he's 205 pounds. Missouri has him listed at 208. He reminds me more of a 188, right? He carries the weight well. But he's right now clearly the number one. The other guy that was in the conversation coming in this last year was Evan Stewart. Evan Stewart, formerly of Texas A&M, who really hasn't had that big breakout. So far in 2 seasons at Texas A&M, he's had 91 receptions, 1,163 yards, and in 18 games. Transferred away from Texas A&M this past year. He's currently at Oregon with Dylan Gabriel, who transferred from Oklahoma, and Tez Johnson. Tez Johnson is a guy that has a lot of people's respects right now at Oregon. Last year, they said that Tez Johnson was the best receiver at Oregon with Troy Franklin. Troy Franklin, of course, drafted by the Denver Broncos in the 4th round of the 2024 NFL draft. But Tez Johnson was like a stepbrother to, or an adopted brother to Bo Nix and his family. And Tez Johnson last year had 1,100 yards, 10 touchdowns, 3rd most receiving yards in a single season in Oregon history. Single season record for receptions, 86 in Oregon history. All conference, all Pac-12. Tez Johnson's another guy in this conversation. So Oregon, I had ranked number 4 in that grouping I was talking about before for the 2024 season. Tez and Evan Stewart. Evan Stewart, though, like I said, hasn't had that full-blown breakout, but you could see it happening in 2024 playing with Tez and vaulting himself back up to that number 1 overall spot. Of course, you have Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State. Emeka Egbuka is a guy that 2 years ago had over 1,000 receiving yards playing with Marv, playing with Jackson Smith and Jigba. And this past year, he was only around the 500-yard marker while dealing with some injuries. And, of course, Marv was the alpha in the offense. But Egbuka has 1,666 receiving yards over the last 2 seasons. he's playing with a lot of dudes at Ohio State, but a lot of those dudes are young and they're not going to be draft eligible. So the one Ohio State guy that's likely to be drafted next year is going to be Emeka Egbuka. Another name that comes to mind in this class is a name that I butcher time after time, and I'm going to get better at this one as we continue to go through the process. But Teteroa McMillan, 6'5" from Arizona, a dog. 1,400 receiving yards last year, 10 touchdowns, over 107 yards per game on average. Tetero, playing with Noah Fafita at Arizona, vaulted himself into this conversation after a massive, massive season in 2023. And he feels right now, because of the build of Luther Burden, the build of Evan Stewart, Emeka Egbuka, these guys are 5'11", 6 foot, 6'1", about 200 pounds, 205, 195. Teteroa being 6'5" and 205, 210 pounds in this class, and literally had 700 yards as a freshman, 1,400 as a sophomore, puts himself kind of in the conversation to be next year's Brian Thomas, 2025's Brian Thomas, right? But he's not as volatile as Brian Thomas. He's a better route runner through and through early film that we've watched. And I believe he could be, again, we're still a ways out, but he could be closer to, not in the same conversation, but closer to the Marvin, the Adnai, the AJ Green conversation, closer to that conversation than a Brian Thomas conversation, where Thomas really has just that one trick, and it's the speed. And in college, he could take the top off the defense. And that was one thing that Jaden Daniels could continue to do, is get him the rock. So Teteroa McMillan's going to be in that top 5. So those are the main guys that come to mind. Evan Stewart from Oregon, Luther Burden from Missouri, Teteroa McMillan from Arizona, Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State. Of course, I mentioned Tez Johnson from Oregon. We had a couple of transfers, though. Isaiah Bond from Alabama goes to Texas. Isaiah Bond, of course, famously for the Auburn touchdown. The touchdown against Auburn as time expired. He finished last year with 40 receptions, 668 yards, and a touchdown. He's at Texas now after a transfer this past offseason, and Texas kind of revamped. So they lost Adonai Mitchell, they lost Xavier Worthy, and they lost Jatavian Sanders, and of course Jordan Whittington, the culture builder in that team, in the 6th round. And they brought in Isaiah Bond from Alabama. This was thought to be the alpha in the room. It was also thought that he would play a lot in the slot, and we did not see that during the spring transition period. That was a lot of DeAndre Moore, a 4-star prospect from St. John Bosco that has been at Texas. He was playing in the slot the majority of the time, and it was Isaiah Bond that was on the outside, opposite of 5-star sophomore Jonte Cook, who is not yet eligible for the NFL draft. He'll be a 2026 guy, but I mean, he's the early drawing on Jonte Cook is sick. It's a combination of Xavier Worthy, and if you want to just comp it to the Texas guys, it's a combination of Xavier Worthy and Adonai Mitchell. Really, what it is. He's not as slight a frame as X is, and he's definitely not as big as Adonai, but he plays with that innate ability to kind of run the routes at crisp and dominate out of the break and adjust his speed levels. And he has the 10.5 track speed. But Isaiah Bond is the transfer from Alabama that right now is mocked, on those way too early mocks. He's mocked sometimes at the end of the 1st round. So he's up in this top 5 conversation as well. Texas did also have a couple of more transfers. Silas Bolden, who led the Oregon State Beavers in receiving yards last year, playing with Anthony Gould. Silas Bolden, a return specialist as well, 23 yards per return at Oregon State as a kick returner. He is now at Texas as well. He did not play in the spring period, however, because he was working on graduating from Oregon State. Matthew Golden, another transfer receiver from Houston, still has a year left on his eligibility. I feel as if the depth at Texas is going to cause a Matthew Golden type to return to school. However, he did amass over 400 return yards at Houston, averaging about 30 yards per kick return. He's a guy that is going to be able to come in and play all 3 positions, probably mostly slot and mostly Z. But again, he's going to be playing with and behind DeAndre Moore and Jonte Cook because of the sheer depth on the roster. So there's a couple more guys. Travis Hunter, of course, everybody knows I don't really have to get into Travis Hunter. He plays corner. He's going to play receiver. My early feel, I have him ranked in here in the top 10 at the receiver position, but my early feel would be that this guy he goes ahead and plays corner in the NFL, and that's his focus point. And yeah, the teams may utilize him on the offensive side of the football as a gadgety guy, but Travis Hunter needs to be drafted as a cornerback in the NFL at the current stage, unless we see something different in 2024. And that's nothing against his pure talent on offense, because he has pure raw talent on offense, and he's good at certain things, but he's much cleaner on the defensive side of the football. One more transfer. Again, we'll stay in the SEC there. Oklahoma, Deion Burks. Man, this guy, talk about making a statement on your first day at the new school. Deion Burks spent a couple seasons at Purdue. He transfers over to Oklahoma. At Purdue, he was 25% of the team's receiving yards, and that's not really saying a lot because Purdue's not generally that great. They did have Aiden O'Connell a couple years ago. He played with him, but he transfers over to Oklahoma, and in the first audition, spring game, with Jackson Arnold at the helm at quarterback, Jackson Arnold did not have a great day, but Deion Burks was disgusting. 5 receptions, 174 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And he took over that one role that Drake Stoops was in last year. And he said, you know what, Drake Stoops, you're a really good route runner. You're really small. You're really finesse, but you don't have the explosion that your boy Deion Burks does. And that's what Deion Burks brought to this offense. So replace Dylan Gabriel with Jackson Arnold. Should be a long-term play, long-term positivity. And then replace Drake Stoops with Deion Burks. This Oklahoma offense, if they can, backfill some of this offensive line and defensive line, they'll be a pretty hard out overall again in 2024. They also have Nick Anderson, who broke out as a sophomore this past year, going near 800 yards and 10 touchdowns, led the team. Nick Anderson's a bigger guy, 6'3", 6'4". I love the way he wins downfield. It's similar to an Adonai, but he's more kind of more similar to a Terrace Marshall, which I know people are going to hate that comp because Terrace didn't exactly pan out for the Panthers. But Nick Anderson's a guy that we could see declare if he goes over 1,000 yards this year. He and Deion Burks both becoming draft eligible and declaring would not be something that would shock me. So Nick Anderson, I think, is on the cusp of being a top 12 guy. Another name that's kind of sleepier and further down the list is Colin Lacey. Colin Lacey was at South Alabama this last year, 65 receptions, 816 yards, 6 touchdowns, and he entered the transfer portal as a top 5 option and went to Louisville. And Louisville added Ja'Cory Brooks from Alabama. They added Colin Lacey from South Alabama, and they added Antonio Meeks, who was at Tuskegee for 2 seasons. He had 1,400 yards and 11 touchdowns at Tuskegee, a Division II team. Louisville's interesting. Louisville's building this thing back. In my notes about Louisville, I wrote, these guys, they won 18 games the last 2 seasons, and I know Jeff Brom hasn't been there for each of the last 2 seasons. This past year was his first season, but they haven't won 18 games since Teddy Bridgewater was there with Charlie Strong back in 2012, 2013. So Louisville's on the right track, and I think bringing in a receiving core that is perfectly rated for this situation. Ja'Cory Brooks, he's coming down from Alabama. Technically, it's a decrease in job from Alabama to Louisville. Colin Lacey coming up from South Alabama, which isn't quite FCS, but it's still lower level. And then Antonio Meeks, a Division II guy. Like, this is going to be the perfect concoction of receivers, and I think Colin Lacey is one that could reap the benefits, because Ja'Cory Brooks, if he doesn't take that step back up, again, he only had 54.9 PFF grade this last year in receiving. If he doesn't take that step back up, we could see Colin Lacey be the alpha in this offense and go north of 1,000, north of 1,100 receiving yards for Louisville, who's going to be competitive in the ACC again, as they were last year on their way to the ACC championship loss to Florida State, which, you could argue if they had a couple more weapons, that would have been a little bit of a better ending, or maybe a little better output on the field that we would have saw from Louisville if maybe Jack Plummer wasn't at the helm at the quarterback position. But 2 more guys I want to talk about before we get out of here. One is Torrey Horton. Torrey Horton from Colorado State. Torrey Horton's been at Colorado State for just 2 seasons. He was at Nevada for 2 seasons before that. And he's been consistent at Colorado State. Over 1,100 yards each of the last 2 seasons, 8 touchdowns each of the last 2 seasons. His yards per reception came down last year from 16 to 11. So he's working across in different areas. Horton, 6'2", 175. He's a lighter guy. If he comes in this next year at 185 and goes again for 1,500 yards, 1,400 yards, the conversation is going to be had that this is going to be the smaller school guy. You remember a couple years ago when we had back-to-back years with Colorado State guys coming out. Michael Gallup, of course, just signed with the Raiders. But they can produce. Warren Jackson was a guy that kind of never hit, but he came out of Colorado State in that same trajectory. So Torrey Horton's another name to keep in mind. And then one more from NC State is Kevin. Again, the last name's a little goofy. Kevin Concepcion, I think is how you say it. Kevin Concepcion, who was a sophomore this last year, 71 receptions, 840 yards, and 10 touchdowns. He's an interesting one for me. I haven't watched anything on him, so I'm not going to comment much, but Kevin Concepcion is on the radar. Barry and Brown from Kentucky is on the radar. There's a bevy of dudes here. I don't think the overall depth is going to be what it was in 2024 draft. I don't think the top end talent is going to be what it was in the 2024 draft. We've seen the NFL draft the last 3 seasons just get better and better and better at the receiver position. I don't want to deflate the bubble on the receiving group, but it's not going to be at the same depth. It's not going to be at the same top-end talent, but we are going to have some great pieces in this NFL draft. And I haven't even brought up LSU yet because LSU is going to have a regression to the mean at the receiver position, despite acquiring a couple of very talented receivers through the portal, mainly C.J. Daniels from Liberty this past year, who had a 10 touchdown, 1,000-yard season. And you know what? I'm going to leave you with this one because we haven't talked about LSU yet. Everybody knows Kyron Lacey. Everyone knows Chris Hilton, Aaron Anderson. But Xavier Thomas from Mississippi State last year, 40 receptions, 500 yards, and a touchdown. Xavier Thomas, I've watched a little bit of him this year, and that's my early guy in the clubhouse that if all things fall in a certain direction at LSU, where C.J. Daniels is a bigger guy, he should be playing in that Brian Thomas role. Kyron Lacey should take that step up. He was 3rd last year on the Tigers in receiving with 30 receptions, 558 yards, and 7 tugs. If everything falls in line and Kyron Lacey does not take over as the solo alpha, I could see Xavier Thomas earning that role and vaulting himself into the top 8 in the 2025 NFL draft class at the wide receiver position. Xavier Thomas is a sleeper as we get closer to the season for the LSU Tigers. It's an interesting receiving core to watch. And of course, they're always going to be in the conversation for wide receiver U, but they've fallen down a little bit. It's not going to be like the last couple of years with Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas. They got some ground to make up. It's a good class. It's not great. I'm Cody Carpentier with the draft rankings. You can check out thedraftrankings.com, dynasty rankings, rookie rankings, cornerstone rankings, 2025 NFL draft stuff, 2026 wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, everything, you name it. It's all over there at the draft rankings. We're continuing to build and grow and grow and grow. I'm going to be doing the solo show every single Monday. We'll have myself and Seth on one day this week. We'll have myself and Matty on one day this week. That's going to be the plan going forward. Is it will have a rotation. So not all 3 shows will be the same. And of course, don't forget to go over and watch The Hurdle on Tuesdays and Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. on the Executives of Fantasy Football YouTube channel. I appreciate you guys. I love you, and we out.